whatever it was before he had it.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming to tonight's event. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Ian Black, who's the Middle East editor at The Guardian, who will chair tonight's discussion. Before I do so, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting live. Obviously, we're down one speaker at the moment, but he will be with us very shortly. So, over to Ian.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good evening. Welcome to the Frontline Club, to this very timely discussion on Iraq. You're all, I'm sure, following the news, otherwise I doubt whether you would be here on such a warm, almost Baghdad-like evening. I think there are usually a couple of ground rules, aren't there? I think we're going to explain a little bit what we're going to do. We're going to ask each of the, actually 4 speakers, one of them not yet here, the other one virtually will be soon, to make a few introductory remarks, maximum no more than about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to throw open the event to questions from you, the audience. I think that we like people to give their name and identify themselves if they belong to any organisation, and also please to ask questions, not to make statements. I think that's the most important thing. Mobile phones turned off, on silent, all those usual kind of things. Iraq, the crisis of the last couple of weeks has burst upon the world with extraordinary force, ferocity. People who perhaps thought they knew what was going on in Iraq have been stunned to discover that it was really quite an important and very difficult story unfolding. I think one of the interesting questions I'd like to just throw out into the ether, as it were, is why have we been, I use the we in the kind of broadest sense, been taken by surprise by this story, where I'm sure we will hear from our speakers that there were plenty of warning signs over quite a long period. There's all kinds of questions that arise, questions about Iraq itself, the nature of what's going on, the role, the significance of ISIS, which I think we call it. We can have an interesting discussion about whether it should be called ISIS or something else in English or in Arabic, whatever. The role of ISIS, the sectarian aspects of the crisis, Sunni, Shia, the legacy of the invasion of 2003. There's lots to talk about. Iran, the United States, this country with its involvement, reminders from Tony Blair that we've had in recent days too about that. So let me introduce the 2 guests who are here. I'll mention the others as well. On my right is Hayder al-Khoei, who is an Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. On the further right is Dominic Asquith, who is a 30-year veteran of the Middle East in the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office. He was the Deputy Special Representative and the Deputy Head of the UK mission in Iraq in 2004, was in charge of the Iraq Directorate at the Foreign Office and Ambassador to Iraq from 2006 to 2007. We're going to be joined soon, I hope, by Zuhair al-Nahr, who's a spokesman for Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi Prime Minister. And on Skype, we have Zaid al-Ali, who's a senior advisor on constitutional building for International IDEA and author of The Struggle for Iraq's Future. He's a legal advisor to the UN in Iraq. So we have a star-studded panel, and we will await the arrival of Zuhair, but we will begin, please, with a few words of introduction and context from Hayder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I just want to start by saying, though this is not an open Sunni-Shia conflict now, things can very well move in this direction over the coming weeks, possibly even days, depending on chiefly how the Shia militias are going to respond. Several militias have mobilized now, and I think their conduct is going to be key in terms of how the other side or the Sunnis in Iraq respond, but also whether or not ISIS can pull off another spectacular attack. And by spectacular, I don't just mean taking more cities to the north or west, but pulling off a symbolically much more powerful attack along the lines of the 2006 shrine demolition in Samarra, which unleashed horrific waves of sectarian violence. And I think would happen again, not just in Iraq, but in the wider Middle East. And I think it'll be worse than 2006. Just briefly on what actually happened in Mosul, nobody knows what actually happened in Mosul. There are conflicting reports on whether the leadership collapsed, the soldiers fled because they were not welcome and not prepared to die, or because they were given orders from above. What we do know is that dozens of senior army officers have been court-martialed over their conduct, and I think we're going to get more details in the coming weeks. What we do know is that the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, or ISIS, is not working alone. It's just illogical for hundreds of fighters to take a city the size of Mosul and rout the Iraqi armed forces, which number between 40 and 60,000 in Mosul. They have a lot of support, local support from both civilians as well as other armed groups. Groups like the Naqshbandi army, which is a sort of Sufi Ba'athist insurgency led by one of Saddam Hussein's deputies. You also have many tribal forces. Some are just fronts for the Ba'athists, but others are just local tribes who have had enough of the failures in Iraq. You have Ansar al-Islam, Salafi jihadists, who though share the same ideology as ISIS, are rivals with them. And Jaysh al-Mujahideen as well, who are Islamist nationalist insurgents. The key point, and why I mention these different groups, is the thing I think we have to bear in mind is that for the most powerful of these insurgent groups, what's happening and their advances have absolutely nothing to do with winning more rights for the Sunni Arab community, or even defending the Sunni Arabs in Iraq, despite that being their narrative. It's much bigger than that. It's about overthrowing the Iraqi government, regardless of whether or not Maliki is prime minister. And I say this because the most powerful groups fighting, simply do not believe in the democratic process in Iraq, and never will, as long as the demographics in Iraq remain unchanged. Of course, Maliki's policies, I believe, have added fuel to the fire, and his misguided, especially security policies, have antagonized the local populations north of Baghdad, and even in Baghdad, the Sunni population. But it is much bigger than Maliki, and a Kuwaiti analyst summed it up perfectly for me when he said on Al-Arabiya, this started before Maliki and it will continue after Maliki. Just also briefly, and I was in Baghdad just before and after the fall of Mosul, and I also went to the south in Najaf. Regardless of who you speak to, there's a real sense that the jihadist groups and insurgents in Iraq have psychologically refused to acknowledge the post-2003 political order, not because they are being marginalized by the government, but simply because the Shia are now in power. And there's a real sense, again, across Baghdad in the south, that for the most powerful of these groups, and ISIS is just the tip of the spear in Iraq, there's a belief that these groups want to pull the rug from underneath the feet of the Shia. The groups fighting the central government and the armed forces have very competing ideologies, and they are rivals with each other. So ISIS, you obviously want to establish a caliphate and impose strict Islamic law, and the Ba'athists want to return to the pre-2003 order. It was a secular dictatorship, and of course these things aren't compatible. There have already been clashes between the main Naqshbandi Ba'athist army and ISIS. 17 were killed a couple of days ago, and I think it will get much bloodier. On just the final comment on the sectarian aspect, I don't want to deny there is sectarianism in Iraq, or that it's a real problem, but I don't think this is a sectarian war, despite there being very obvious sectarian actors. And I think the image we're being constantly fed by the mainstream media does not give us the full picture. And just listing very brief points, there are several high-profile Sunni religious clerics and several high-profile Sunni politicians who also see ISIS as a terrorist threat to them, their communities, and to Iraq. Now, this is not to say that Sunni clerics or Sunni politicians agree with the government or support the government, but there can be no doubt that they also see ISIS as a threat to themselves. And this was very clearly shown to us when they met last week at Ibrahim al-Ja'fari's house, one of the leading Shia politicians, to declare ISIS as a common enemy and a threat to all. And very lastly, I have a problem with the media's labeling of ISIS as Sunni jihadists. And I think that obscures as much as it explains. Technically, yes, they are Sunni, but that's not very helpful in understanding who these people actually are. ISIS are violent, extremist Salafis. And in that respect, they are a tiny minority within a minority, who are the Salafis, within mainstream Sunni Islam. And I think I've run out of time. I wanted to briefly talk about Sistani Fatwa, but I think we'll leave that to...
Can we leave Sistani to one side just for the moment? Let me just say welcome to Zuhair. I'll just explain briefly what we're going to do. I hope you don't mind. Dominic is going to follow on now. Then we'd like to hear from you on whatever you think fit in response to what you've heard before for up to about 5 minutes as an introductory set of remarks. And then we'll go to Zaid over there too, and then we're going to go to the audience. So if that's okay, we'll proceed on that basis. So Dominic, thanks.
Ian, thank you very much, and good evening to you all. In this sort of blame game, can you hear at the back? Yeah. In this blame game that seems to be very popular, I think it's important to bear in mind two things, that the blame needs to be distributed pretty widely. Since 2003, regularly the decisions were taken, as far as outsiders were concerned, were taken in capitals according to the interests, the political interests of those in the capitals, their particular ideologies or analysis, not according to what was good in Iraq. As far as the insiders, those inside Iraq, look at who is arraigned on ISIS's side, currently against Baghdad. It is the same mixture, roughly, of jihadists, Salafist or extremists, Ba'athi, ex-Ba'athi, and tribal sheikhs from the Sunni Arab side that have been there from doing the same sort of thing at various points since 2003, 2004, 2006, 2013, you pick it. And why? Because broadly, there has never been a unifying vision for Iraq from any of the political leadership. So spread that blame around. We can go into the details more in the questions. Interestingly, therefore, and slightly worryingly, when Kerry says that Iraq's future depends on the ability of its leaders to come together to take a united stand, I have to say my heart sinks, because they've never done it. They've never certainly taken a united stand for anything. Sometimes they have combined against. But it looks to me as if there's a real risk that we will go back to rebuilding a house of cards once again. So keep in mind this idea that actually the competition that has been raging from outsiders and insiders has been counterproductive in terms of the interests of the actors, except possibly the Kurds, which I'm sure we will come to. But for the others, Arabs, the Iranians, the West, possibly Turkey, the long-term interests have been undermined by this idea of winner takes all. It's not in the interest of Iran that Iraq should fall apart. Iraq is the deep defense for Iran. It's not in the interest of the Gulf, certainly not the Saudis, that there should be an Islamic caliphate in part of Iraq. It is not in the interest of the West that there should be an ever larger pool of terrorists who will continue their campaign against us. And it's not in anybody's interest that the humanitarian suffering, which is terrible, should get worse. So if you're looking ahead, there's a sort of three-part solution. One is contain ISIS, and military support from outside may be necessary for that, if it is really so that the Iraqi National Army has been reduced to such incapacity that it cannot do that. And we may be entering a world of enclaves. We've got it in Afghanistan, we've got it in Somalia, we've got it in Pakistan, we've got it in Yemen. Maybe we're having another enclave for a time in Iraq and Syria. If that means drone attacks against jihadi-controlled areas, that may be necessary. Interesting question. perhaps to develop later. When Kerry says ISIS cannot be given safe haven anywhere, does that mean the battle needs to be taken to them in Syria? So contain ISIS. Secondly, a new leadership in Baghdad, by which I mean one that abandons sectarianism and pursues the interests of all Iraqis. That might mean decentralization of authority to the Sunni Arabs. It might mean that. It might even mean an expanded area for the KRG, for the Kurdish area in the north. It might mean that there have to be federal structures with an intelligent sharing of the resources. That may not be so bad, but there has to be a new leadership. And thirdly, you're not going to solve Iraq in terms of ISIS for as long as Syria goes on in the way it is going on. So there has to be a regional approach. There has to be thought of in regional terms. And the big issue, the big idea there, unquestionably in my mind, is change the dynamics in terms of how the Iranians and the West look at each other. When you start changing those dynamics and stop it being an aggressor or a hostile battle between the two, then you begin to be able to deal with some of these intractable questions, Iraq and Syria being the most obvious ones, then you'll be able to deal with that. And the best way into that one is the indirect route, as far as Iraq and Syria are concerned, which is the nuclear talks. That's it, Ian.
Thank you, Dominic, very useful. Tour d'horizon. And so let's go to Zuhair, please. Go on.
Thank you very much.
Same basis, thank you.
Thank you. I'm privileged to have such enlightened speakers with me. I'm going to say a series of media headlines, because that's what we all love, and then comment on them. One media headline: Maliki is the cause of all this recent upheaval. Well, as Dominic said, I think blame needs to be spread. And I was in a hard talk discussion earlier on with as one other guest, who was Christopher Hill, former US ambassador to Iraq. And he said something really profound, which very few Western politicians have said so far. He said one of the main problems is that the Sunni politicians have yet to come to terms with the fact that the majority are Shia and the minority are Sunni, and they cannot yet understand or appreciate or come to terms with the fact that they are a minority. That is not to say that Maliki is blameless. Maliki has made mistakes. However, Maliki has a mandate higher than anyone else. He has had the largest number of votes, personal votes, 700,000, 3 times more than his rival, and he has 3 times larger a political bloc than any of his rivals. So blame needs to be distributed. Maliki cannot reach out to Sunnis if they do not want to engage, some of them. Thank you.
Hang on.
Number 2, this is a sectarian conflict, a Shia and Sunni conflict. As Hayder said, there are elements of this, but it is not primarily a Shia-Sunni conflict. This is how ISIS want to turn it into. They want to turn it into a Shia-Sunni conflict. And this is how anyone who wants to destroy the political process in Iraq and to create sectarian upheaval want to aim at. The former Saddamists, Baathists, and ISIS want to turn it into a sectarian conflict. However, the people amongst themselves, we have lived for hundreds of years peacefully, we intermarry. It is shameful to ask an Iraqi, are you a Shia or a Sunni, or for that matter, a Christian. It is shameful. We don't do that. We are all Iraqis, and that's how we want to see ourselves. Number 3, the Sunnis have been oppressed, marginalized, downtrodden, abused, and all the other words that have been branded in the media. There may be elements of this, but these descriptions are hugely exaggerated. If the Sunnis were in such a bad way, how is it they have the head of the parliament is a Sunni, the deputy prime minister is a Sunni, the 5 Sunni ministers from one province, Anbar province, and Basra, which is one of the largest provinces and has 80% of Iraq's riches, has no minister. It's a Shia province. The head of the army is a Sunni. 45% of Iraqi ambassadors are Sunni. How is it, if they are so abused, how is it that they have such representation in government? Clearly, this is an exaggerated view to describe the Sunnis as downtrodden and abused and marginalized. And it serves well those who want to use that as an excuse to attack the political system. The Baathists want to use this, the extremist terrorists want to use this in order to discredit the political system. And finally, the local Sunni population have given support to the ISIS terrorists. No. This is why, if they had given support, we wouldn't have 500,000 civilians fleeing as soon as ISIS took over Mosul. The civilian population, as in Fallujah, have been terrorized by these extremists. They have no choice. That is not to say there aren't radicalized elements who have followed them, just as there are radicalized people in this country who have followed ISIS. So, just some points for thought. Thank you very much.
Zuhair, thank you very much. So we heard a noise from Zaid a moment ago. So let's hear some words, please, in response to. I guess you can hear all right, yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
In response to the other 3 speakers, and then we'll go to the audience. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I apologize for that outburst. I thought I was on mute, so I thought I was speaking to myself. I also apologize in advance because my son's around the corner and he could come in any second. I couldn't find a babysitter for tonight, so just a warning. So just briefly, what I would like to talk about just to start out with is just to describe how bad the situation is in Iraq now and the parts of the country that are under control of ISIS. If you're from Tikrit nowadays, you're essentially living in a country that's completely detached from the rest of the country. If you want to go from Tikrit to Mosul, then you have to cross, from Tikrit to Erbil, you have to cross through 2 borders. If you want to go through, with one being at Kirkuk and the other being in, sorry, bear with me. Sorry about that, I'm sorry. If you want to go from Tikrit to Erbil, now you have to cross through Kirkuk border and Erbil border. If you want to go from Tikrit to Baghdad, the only way to go is to go from Tikrit to Erbil and then to take a plane to Baghdad. So Tikritis now who have relatives in Baghdad, the only way for them to reach their relatives in Baghdad, they have to go through 2 border crossings and then take an airplane. So when people talk about dismemberment, it's very real, it's very dangerous. And I'm not sure if everyone really grasps how bad the situation is today. I mean, it's really concrete. When you're in that situation, you have to cross, and it takes 24 hours to cross a single border crossing into Kirkuk, and then another 24 hours to cross into Erbil, and then you have to wait a week to take a plane to Baghdad just to go see your relatives, same country as you. In terms of what happened in Mosul, we obviously don't know. Hayder is right. We don't know exactly what happened. But there were many warning signs that have been going on for a long time. Incompetence, politicized appointments, corruption, nepotism, and ISIS's presence going unchallenged for years in Mosul. All the kidnappings, the extortion, so on and so forth. People have been writing about this for a long time. A lot of people have been warning about the build-up in Mosul for a long time. We don't know why the army has collapsed, but we do know that ISIS, and we have known that ISIS has been building up its presence for a long time. So the question is, why wasn't anything done about it for a long time? The other issue is what Hayder mentioned, my friend Hayder mentioned, about ISIS and the other groups and who's in control and so on and so forth. Obviously, at this stage, it's very early and we don't have a very clear picture. However, all evidence on the ground points to ISIS being in a pole position. ISIS is firmly in control of places like Tikrit and Beji and in Mosul. There may be other groups that are present and that are riding on the wave that ISIS has created. But ISIS is certainly in Tikrit and in those other places that I mentioned earlier, in firm control. You can tell by the garb, you can tell by the flags, you can tell by the rhetoric, you can tell by their actions. I think that to a certain extent, it may be either wishful thinking or I don't know what, on the part of many people to think that former Baathists may be in control in Tikrit. Perhaps some people hope that it might be Baathists because they think that they might be able to deal with the Baathists. I don't know, or maybe what others want to do is to spread the blame around. But evidence on the ground certainly points to ISIS being in firm control. Sorry about that. In terms of possible solutions, this is the main point and perhaps a point that I want to end on, is what do Sunnis want? Zuhair mentioned, my friend Zuhair mentioned that many Sunnis haven't come to terms with the fact that they aren't a majority and that they want to be a majority, or they don't accept that the Shia are a majority. I must say that I know the Sunni community very well in Iraq. This is I have deep roots in that community, and I spend a lot of my time with them, and I have family and so on and so forth. And I've been spending a lot of time with them over a period of years. I've been following how the rhetoric has been evolved over a period of years. I must say that no one ever talks about that. I mean, maybe some people in the political leadership, I don't know. Maybe some fringe groups, maybe ISIS talks about it, I don't know. But your bread and butter, the rank and file, the people that are part of the community, the police officers, the teachers, and so on and so forth, no one talks about that. Zuhair also talks about how can Maliki reach out if he doesn't really have genuine partners, and he also talks about, well, they have adequate representation in the government and in parliament and in ambassadors and so on and so forth. But what he doesn't talk about, and I have sympathy for his position, what Zuhair doesn't mention, is what the people in the Sunni community talk about every day, right? And what they talk about every day now, what they've been talking about every day for the past few years, is random arrests, torture, the fact that they have to pay to get their relatives to be released from prison, the fact that people are arrested without charge, they're never brought before judges, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, not all of them, but a very, very large group of them. It happens to a lot of them. I know lots of cases, and there's been very, very well documented. This is all they talk about. That's all they talk about. When you sit down with these people on a day-to-day basis, they don't talk about how many ambassadors they have. They don't talk about al-Khoei, they don't talk about Tariq al-Hashimi, they don't talk about Mutlaq, and so on and so forth. It makes no difference to them if Hashimi is in government or outside of government. What these people want is to be treated equally by the security forces. They want to have equitable treatment by the police and by the military. Maybe back in 2003 they wanted something else, I don't know. But certainly over the past 3 years, that's all they have been talking about. And I think it's about time that everyone, meaning people in the Iraqi government, in the media, in the foreign political sphere, so on and so forth, it's about time that everyone stops talking about inclusivity in government, so on and so forth. I don't think anyone really cares what percentage of ministers are Sunni or Shia. What I think people do care about is having an equal chance of getting a job, and also not to be arrested randomly for no reason, and also not to be tortured when you're detained, and also to be brought before a judge, and so on and so forth. In terms of Maliki, and it's starting before Maliki, and so on and so forth, that's absolutely true. This didn't start with Maliki. However, Maliki has been in charge now for 8 years, 8 out of 11 post-war years. And Maliki's concentrated a lot of power in his hands. There have been other ministers that have been very responsible for a lot of mistakes, but he really needs to bear the brunt of this, and he needs to really accept the catastrophe that's been laid at our feet. And I think it's about time. Our colleague also from the Foreign Service mentioned that a new leadership is needed. I don't know if that was code word for what it is that I'm about to say, but obviously Maliki really needs to step down and let someone else have a crack at this. Because at the current juncture, if you follow the trend and you see where it is that we're going, it's not in a good direction. Nothing new will happen with a continued Maliki tenureship. We need something new. We need someone new. We need new leadership with a new agreement. I'll end it there. Perhaps we can talk more about this during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastically comprehensive, I think, first round from the speakers. So what I propose, if anybody objects, say so. I think I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I think perhaps for the sake of efficiency, we should have, say, maybe 3 questions at a time and address them as a group. So if somebody asks a question and somebody else is very anxious to ask something closely related to it, if you kind of gesticulate and wave your arms, I'll give you preference, just for the sake of efficiency and the best use of time. So, gentleman over there, please. Have you got a mic? Yeah. And perhaps you should also, if you want to address your question to a particular member of the panel or all of them or whatever.
Thank you very much. The question is for the entire panel. Although I have for some time been an advocate of Asquithism, my name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet Union for customs and excise, and I've worked in the Soviet countries. That's what triggered off the remark about Asquithism, which I can assure you is a compliment. And the question is, what do we know about the logistics and finance of ISIS and their pseudo-allies or whatever in the Baathists? And I would also, particularly in relation both on the logistics and finance side of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to ask a question? Is it closely related or completely different? So please, go.
Hi, John Drake from AKE, and I have hundreds of questions, but I think it's
I can't
mainly
really
for you.
hear you very well.
Sorry, John Drake from AKE, and I have loads of questions, but I think the main one I want to ask is to you, Zuhair. Why didn't Nouri al-Maliki's government incorporate the Sahwa Awakening Council into the security forces?
Okay, short and sweet. Another one for this group of questions? Gentleman over there, thanks.
I just think some people, speculating some of the articles, press is. So my question is, Mr. Asquith, you might know. I mean, did the neocons intend this? I mean, what I'm saying is, it's because it's I mean, that's just a point because it's just been because I'm saying is that you see, I mean, people before. So, for example, the leaders of the first Gulf War all said it'd be crazy to push on to Baghdad. For example, Colin Powell said it would be result in a Persian Gulf Vietnam. Bush Senior wrote in 1998, we could still be occupying a bitty hostile land, and Dick Cheney made similar remarks in 1994. So that's why I'm asking that question.
Okay, thanks. So should we take those? Whoever wants to kick off. There was the question about ISIS and logistics and finance. Who's best qualified to speak on that? My guess would be Zuhair. Maybe not.
I'm not a complete expert on ISIS.
I actually meant Hayder.
I can't speak to their logistics. They are obviously extremely organized. But on the finance side, I think Zaid mentioned something interesting, which was they were there for years in Mosul, and estimates range between $2 and $8 million per month just from extortion and from racketeering and mafia-like activities in Mosul, forcing local businesses, even big construction companies, telecommunication companies, forcing them to pay a monthly fee. But of course, there is a lot of money also from the Gulf. Now, this is mainly private donors in the Gulf, but clearly the Gulf governments aren't doing much to stop it, especially in places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I think recently, and last 2 years, Kuwait has possibly even overtaken Qatar as the main financial center, not just for ISIS, but even for the official al-Qaeda franchise in the Middle East and other jihadist groups. I think there was a US Treasury report recently talking about how they're trying to get them to cut off the financial taps. As far as Turkey is concerned, I'm not sure about the money, but clearly they are allowing jihadists free access to their border. A friend was traveling to Antakya on the plane, and a fellow passenger said, "Are you going for jihad in Syria?" So, and he felt stereotyped that he's just because he's going to Antakya is to jihad. So clearly the Turks want these people to go and cause problems, for their enemies. And it's worth bearing also, last year after the famous Abu Ghraib prison, hundreds of jihadists escaped, hardened, many of them on death row. They didn't go from Anbar, which is the west of Iraq, to Syria. They went up north through Mosul into Turkey, and then across Turkey, and then back down to Syria. And this is their own, on Twitter, boasting about how easy it was to get access through Turkey. So certainly there are also regional players playing very nefarious roles in allowing these people to become stronger.
I've had a somewhat similar, in a different context, experience of same kind of conflict.
Can I ask a kind of supplementary question? Because I think that when you talk about Iraq and Syria, to some extent we're now talking about the same story with regard to ISIS, at least. It's often said that the jihadis, whether it's the ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and so on, are supported by the Saudis. Now, I take your point about private money, but I think it's quite, to me, it's quite an important shift to understand. I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that the Saudis in particular, in the last year or so, have really taken fright at the growth of these al-Qaeda type organizations. And as a state, they're not supporting them at all anymore. On the contrary, they're very worried about the potential for blowback. The issue of private finance, I agree, is important. But I think it's significant to see that a lot of the way people are looking at Iraq and Syria, this dual crisis, is through the prism, if you like, of counterterrorism. And a country which is often accused of promoting it, I think, is actually on that same side of the argument now.
No, I mean, that's a very good point. And when I said Saudi, I meant the private donors.
Sure.
But there's something to bear in mind. The Saudis in places like Syria are funding, overtly funding the groups who are fighting against ISIS. And ISIS and Saudi, of course, don't see eye to eye. One's a decadent monarchy and the other's wants to establish a caliphate. Though it is interesting that the ideological birthplace of these movements are in Saudi Arabia, and there's a strategic marriage of convenience between the Saudi establishment and the Saudi the Saudi political establishment and the Saudi religious establishment. And I don't think it's a coincidence in places like Syria, the areas where ISIS control, the education books, the ones they teach to their students, are Saudi official textbooks. Of course, they plagiarize and take out the first 2 pages, which is the ministerial acknowledgement. But the ideological difference isn't as contradictory as we might assume, just because of the royal family and their relationship with ISIS.
And can I interject one point? And just before that, I should make clear to Zaid and to all of you, I'm not in the Foreign Service at the moment. I left the Foreign Service a year and a bit ago, so what I'm saying is not government policy. On that logistics and financing, I think it's an absolutely crucial question. And when Kerry says they shouldn't be... I'm glad you agree. When Kerry says ISIS shouldn't be given safe haven anywhere, that needs to be unpicked a bit in the sense that the pressure now needs to be applied on those who allow the passage of ISIS officials to wherever they are fighting. There is a Turkish politician, opposition politician you've probably seen, who claims, it was somewhere in the hundreds of millions, I can't remember, $600 million he claims the Turks have paid for oil that is currently in Syria, that is under ISIS control. I assume that's a massive inflation and may be completely fallacious. The point is, there is so much uncertainty and opacity about how they are funding themselves, who is providing them with the money historically and now, that part of the next stage must be ratcheting down, clamping down on their ability to get hold of money and to move. And that means some regional countries, Turkey preeminently, having to control their borders.
Thanks.
Can I say just a couple of words about this?
Please do.
Okay. One recent report that I would draw your attention to is a McClatchy report that was published, I think, either yesterday or today, which is a study of a lot of ISIS documents that were collected, that were seized recently from back in 2010, and which apparently show that the proportion of their money that comes from extortion, kidnapping money, ransom money, so on and so forth, is much higher than the proportion of money that comes from foreign backers in the Gulf and so on and so forth. I was one of the people that was always convinced that funders in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia were essentially bankrolling ISIS, but apparently it turns out that they get a lot more money from all their extortion racket in Mosul. And I and many other people have been warning about this extortion racket for a long time. I've been going along that road from Kirkuk to Tikrit all the way down to Baghdad for years now, and for years I've known that just about every single business on that road pays extortion money to al-Qaeda. Okay, and they've been doing this for years, and sometimes with the acquiescence, with the knowledge, and sometimes with the cooperation of security services, either the police or the army, so on and so forth. This has been going on for a long time, and apparently their biggest pot of money comes from Mosul. This is something that's apparently well established, and it's very, very problematic. And what makes it more problematic is that it's been well known for years, and nothing has been done about it. In terms of the prison breaks that earlier, he mentioned one, but in fact there have been many, many prison breaks. And if you look into the detail of how these prison breaks have taken place, it's also spectacular how incompetent the security services have been in guarding the prisons. On one occasion, there was a prison where the prisoners dug out a tunnel underneath the tunnel, and they were digging out the earth and flushing it down their toilet. And the toilet broke down on several occasions, and the prison authorities called plumbers in order to unplug the toilet in the cell. And they found that there was earth being dumped into the cell's toilet. And they never made the connection that possibly someone might be digging a tunnel, right? It's very, very problematic that these things aren't picked up. It either means that the security guards are incredibly incompetent, or that they're in on it, that someone's being paid to keep quiet. One or the other. It's either you know and it's bad, or you don't know and it's even worse. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to recover the situation.
Okay.
Can I just add
Please,
one
please.
very quick thing? Of course, robberies. Also, there were a spate of robberies of banks and jewelry shops on a large scale in Baghdad and other areas, and those are also connected to al-Qaeda and ISIS. The other thing is the Ba'athist connection. How much funding do the Ba'athist money, which is in its billions, is contributed to ISIS, especially since they cooperate logistically on the ground?
So there was a question about why wasn't the Sahwa movement incorporated into the security forces?
I'm not an expert on Sahwa and how what their situation is. And I can, if you give me your email, I can find out. Our sources, they can give me a background as to what happened to the Sahwas. My view is that some were incorporated, some were, as you know, there is an air of suspicion on the Sahwas. Sahwas change sides very quickly and rapidly, and therefore it makes it a high risk venture to bring in Sahwas en masse into the armed forces. I believe that there was neglect of the Sahwas personally, and I believe that was wrong. If I were Nouri al-Maliki, I would have paid more attention to that. So here's an admission that you wouldn't get normally, would you? But there we are, that's my belief.
Can I throw in one thing about the Sahwa? Because what Zuhair said is correct. And I know this because I was ambassador when the Sahwa was going on, and Petraeus and I had fairly long discussions about the purpose of the Sahwa and how he was going about it. I fundamentally disagreed with him on one particular point. Part of the problem for Maliki, if I have to plead his side on this particular point, is that it was rather taken out of his hands. And he was deeply suspicious of what the American forces were up to in terms of the arrangements being put in place over his head. In that, as part of the Sahwa deal, it was, and your local security, tribal sheikhs, is going to be in your hands too, from locally recruited forces, not from the national forces, which wasn't the brightest thing to do, to be honest. Where I would fault Maliki is, I think, where Zuhair's put it, which is after that, particularly in the period 2008-2010, when there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that Maliki was going after some of the tribal sheikhs at that time, that was a deeply misguided set of policies by Maliki at the heart of government. If there was one way you were going to create or exacerbate distrust, was go after the Sahwa tribal sheikhs.
I just want to mention something very quickly, which Zaid touched upon. Sometimes we over-analyze and over-read into, Shia-Sunni conflict and whether or not there are regionally backed coup attempts or bribes and a variety of conspiracy theories. But I genuinely believe sometimes the simplest explanation is the best. And Zaid mentioned incompetence. He mentioned the hilarious, I think, the tragic story of the prison cell. Last year in Abu Ghraib, 2 days before the actual attack, which released between 5 and 1,000 hardened jihadists, locals in the area began to stockpile food. There was a movement, food prices started going up. Even the man who sells cigarettes outside the prison wall didn't show up on the day they attacked. And Iraq has several intelligence services. At least 3 of them informed Baghdad Operation Command and Maliki's office personally 72 hours before the attack, warning Maliki that there's an imminent attack being planned on Abu Ghraib. No action was taken. Even after they attacked the prison, it took between 8 and 10 hours, and Abu Ghraib is just on the outskirts of Baghdad. It took between 8 and 10 hours for a helicopter to arrive from Baghdad. And so, it's just unprofessionalism, it's basic incompetence. These people can't deal with a group like ISIS.
But that's also part of what happened in Mosul, isn't it, as well, in terms of the military response to events there.
Yeah, I think that's more intriguing, and there's more mystery surrounding Mosul because the Kurdish intelligence says they didn't just warn Baghdad, but on several occasions, months ago, warned the CIA and British intelligence, MI6, and again, no action was taken.
Okay, so
Could I just add one very brief comment about that?
Yeah.
Very briefly. So Hayder is absolutely right to mention Mosul, but you could add to that Tikrit. So Mosul was taken on the 10th. Tikrit was taken 24 hours later by ISIS. So Tikrit is a 2-hour drive from Baghdad. It's just 2 hours away. The central government had 24 hours to react and to send whatever forces it could to defend the city. And I don't know if anyone in your audience or anyone in the panel has ever been to Tikrit, but Tikrit is a very small town. It consists of a highway. That's all it is. It's one highway with some houses on either side. It's a very, very small town. All they needed to have done was to have placed a few armored vehicles on the highway to stop ISIS from breaking through. And instead, nothing was done. Everyone was packing their bags in the morning, getting ready for the ISIS onslaught. And lo and behold, they arrived the next day. They took over the city without a single gunshot being fired. No reinforcements from Baghdad whatsoever. And not only did Baghdad not defend the city, but they didn't do anything to save the hundreds of army recruits that were in bases out of Tikrit. No effort was made whatsoever to protect those people. Even after the massacre started, the famous massacre, now that I'm sure you've heard, you've all heard of. The massacre lasted for 10 hours. People were calling Baghdad saying, please do something. Please send a helicopter, a ship, anything to defend these people, and nothing was done.
Okay, so the last of this bunch of questions was, did the neocons want all this to happen?
It was addressed to me for some particular reason, but I hope not. I think to carry on this motif of incompetence, I think it's probably, if you amass the various incompetent decisions taken early on after 2003, we are seeing the effects of those now in terms of creating a sort of a confessional system and a numbers game. Zuhair's right about the numbers, but so Hayder and Zaid are right. I mean, numbers mean nothing if you don't give those people authority to take decisions. And time and again, in my time there, positions were given to Sunni Arabs, but Maliki towards the end, but even before that, no real authority was given to those Sunni Arabs who were put into the position of vice president or even a deputy prime minister or whatever it may be, or finance minister, you pick it. So there was confessionalism instituted right at the outset. There was, of course, the, in retrospect, utterly disastrous de-Baathification process, which helped create that sort of distrust between communities, and that reliance on exiles who didn't really understand. I felt, I mean, I'm an outsider, so perhaps not for me to say that, but certainly my impression was that the politicians who came in had lived their time outside Iraq, and Iraqis who had lived through the years of Saddam used to say time and again, what do these people really know about what we want? So you were ruling through the wrong people. So put that plus half a dozen other rather incompetent decisions together, and surprise, surprise, you've got violence for 10 years.
I have nothing to add to that, but just to underline and sort of emphasize this whole numbers versus authority thing. What's interesting in the propaganda coming out of ISIS is they're doing precisely this. They're taunting the Sunni politicians. Look at all the positions you have. Look at all the government ministries and deputy prime minister. And not just what have they done for you, what can they do for you without authority. I just think it's a good point to bear in mind. Positions without authority.
I just want to add the effect, really quite far-reaching effect of de-Baathification, because de-Baathification was essentially implemented on a large number of senior Sunni people, because they were the predominant officials at the time of Saddam. And de-Baathification affected not only that level, but the army, the police. So that really did a lot of damage. Of course, there were a lot of Shias who were also Baathists, so it didn't just include Sunnis, but we're talking about the disaffected Sunnis. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Zaid, do you want to come in on that at all? On the question about did the neocons...
I don't really have anything to add.
Okay,
I mean, the issue about de-Baathification has been well documented now.
Okay.
There are so many examples of people who shouldn't have lost their positions, and it's well established that the top tier being de-Baathified, or perhaps even the two top tiers, was understandable, totally understandable. But I have an aunt who was de-Baathified. She was a school teacher and wasn't was a minor figure in the Ba'ath Party. Just a lowly member, and she'll never understand why she was de-Baathified. And she apparently, I never attended one of her classes, but apparently she was quite a good teacher. So it's too bad that she lost her job. But I don't really have anything else to add about the issue of neocons and whether or not they deliberately want to do these things, other than just to say that neocons tend not to be so intelligent and such good strategists. I certainly doubt that they were able to plan 11 years ahead.
Okay, so we can have another round of questions if we've exhausted. There's a lady at the front here, and then guy there, and then guy at the back. Thanks.
I would like to ask why we haven't heard anything here in the papers about a press release issued by Scottish MEP, President of European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with Iraq, Struan Stevenson, and they have created a committee to deal with Iraq. The European Iraqi Freedom Association was formed with very experienced and high-level people. The ex-Vice President of the European Union, he was President for 15 years, Lord Carlisle of this country, presidents of other countries, and they are taking a rather different view. And for one thing, they say that no election organised by Maliki can ever be free or fair. They don't consider that the elections have been free and fair. There's a lot of different opinion in the press of other countries. Washington Post, for instance, has said that for America to be cozying up with Iran against terrorists is rather reminiscent of America and in the 1930s siding with Nazi Germany to defeat communism.
Okay.
So there's a lot of other views. I've got the press release here if anyone would like to have a copy of it.
All right. Thank you. There's some interesting issues there. There was a couple of other people wanted to ask questions at this round. The guy here in the white shirt. Thanks.
Ali Al-Bazaz. Two brief questions. One is about what, in the panel's opinion, would be the likely effect of a likely separation or dependence by the Kurdish region, and what would be the effect on the two remaining predominant communities. And then secondly, we talked about this being a sectarian war, not being a sectarian war. Perhaps it should be that it's not a sectarian war yet. There was a massacre in Talafar of Shia villages, included by ISIS and by their Sunni neighbours. And then some of the Sunni villagers fled, expecting retaliation. In your views, what would it take to push Iraq over the cliff? Surely it's just one big massacre of some sort. And can anything be done to stop that?
Okay. Yeah, the guy here at the...
So my question is, at least we were given to understand when al-Qaeda in Iraq, sort of 5 or 10 years ago, was effectively defeated, that the Sunni population had turned against it as being too extreme and of an ideological slant that was at odds with the lifestyle they wanted to follow. And in the reports of the last couple of weeks, we've been hearing people, ordinary residents in Mosul and other areas controlled by ISIS, saying they are enormously relieved that ISIS is there, and they're very optimistic about how ISIS will improve their lives. Given that it's quite clearly understood that ISIS is the sort of the son of al-Qaeda in Iraq, or at least the ideological descendant of, how has there been such a change in... or at least that's what we've been given to understand in the West, that it's an ideological descendant. Is it understood differently by those ordinary people in Tikrit and Mosul and these other cities under ISIS control? Why isn't that more of the al-Qaeda in Iraq experience more of a cautionary tale for these ordinary people in the street?
Okay, we'll take one more now with this round. The guy at the far end.
Yeah, my question's quite similar. I was just wondering specifically, under the leadership of al-Zawahiri in 2006, he obviously had a specific tactical aim to foment a civil war between the Sunnis and Shiites. I was wondering whether there's been any noticeable change under the al-Baghdadi under his leadership, and if that's particularly in terms of tactical forms, not so much in terms of ideological aims.
Okay, so there's some overlap, isn't there, between those questions? But I mean, the lady at the front who asked about the press release, I don't think anybody can explain why a particular press release hasn't been published anywhere. I think over the last 2 weeks, there's been a huge amount in the media around Iraq, including many of the issues that you mentioned. There's been a huge amount of discussion about Maliki, and we've already heard in the short time we've been here a good deal about that too. I think the question about the US and Iran is an interesting one that perhaps we might want to take a look at. But guys, over to you. Well, please plunge in as you wish.
Can I start with the last two questions? Is that okay?
Please.
Okay. In relation to the question on the population of Mosul and Tikrit being relieved that ISIS is in charge now, I'll just summarize by referring to what my friend Zuhair mentioned earlier, which is that the people in Mosul and Tikrit and so on and so forth are not relieved that ISIS is in charge. They may very well be relieved that they are not subject to discrimination and brutal treatment by the Iraqi military and the checkpoints and so on and so forth. That may be the case, but they're certainly not happy about the arrival of ISIS. And what Zuhair mentioned earlier is absolutely true. The hundreds of thousands of people that left both cities immediately upon ISIS's arrival. Those people didn't leave because they were relieved that ISIS is around. In Tikrit, at one point, 70% of the city was emptied. 70% of the city's population left after ISIS's arrival. And this was after it was clear that an imminent onslaught by the government was not about to start, that it wasn't forthcoming. These people left because they were terrified at the presence of these gunmen. Now, it turns out that some people haven't left, and that some people have even returned to Mosul and to Tikrit. And for the most part, that's for financial reasons. I have friends, colleagues, and relatives who've been forced to go back to these cities because they quickly ran out of money in Erbil and the other places that they moved to. And they have to go back because they simply have no other choice. They have no other way of surviving than to stay back home, than to go back home and to make the best of a very bad situation. In relation to what does al-Baghdadi want in comparison to what his predecessor wanted, I think the best person to ask that question would probably be Baghdadi. I'm not really sure if he's put out any statements about this, but it's very clear that what he wants is to establish an Islamic caliphate which is extremely intolerant, extremely violent, intolerant from a religious point of perspective and also from a basic freedoms perspective as well. And then finally, the other issue was about what could push Iraq over the cliff. That I would just refer back to what it was that what my friend Hayder mentioned earlier, that if there were to be another spectacular attack against a major spiritual shrine or a center of authority, for example, an important ministry or something like that, that could possibly push things over the cliff. But until that happens, for now, we seem to be at some very weird type of stalemate, where Tikrit being just a few miles away from Baghdad, there's no serious effort to retake the city for some very strange reason that is still a mystery to me. And until something major happens, I think we're just going to continue with the current status quo for a while, which is very unfortunate for the people who live in Tikrit and in Mosul, etc., etc.
Okay, thanks. So, does anybody else want to come in on any of those four questions that we had before?
Just to go back to, on the Sahwa stuff, I think it's a really good question. The reason in 2006, 2007 that they sided with American forces against al-Qaeda was because, this was certainly my impression, and I was on the ground at that point, was that from the point of view of the tribal leaders, their control, authority, was being deeply affected and eroded by al-Qaeda operations on the ground. So it was more in their interests to partner with the American forces against that threat, because they knew or calculated that having done so, they would be A, protected by the American forces, and B, they wouldn't be made to make a political compromise with the federal government in Baghdad, where I disagreed with Petraeus's approach. Transposed to now, there are no American forces to hold the ground, to hold the ring, and there is no capability or will on the part of the Iraqi National Army to protect them if they were to side with the National Army against ISIS. And there is another 7 years, in their view, the tribal leaders' view, of a federal government in Baghdad irredeemably opposed to any sort of power sharing, real power sharing. So it's pretty obvious where, from that perspective, where your interests might regrettably lie. In terms of the Kurds, I don't think they will separate at this stage, largely because I don't think they have in place yet sufficient ability to replace the money they would lose when they get it from the federal government in Baghdad. And they don't have yet the security capability to defend the resources, the expanded area of resources now that they have control over. But I think you will see a much greater independence, economic independence, of the Kurdish region from the federal government of Baghdad, certainly for a time, and then there will be a rather complicated series of bargaining over reintegration in some federal way to Iraq. If the reality is that the more separate the Kurdish region becomes, the more exposed the Sunni Arabs become in their rather small enclave, and therefore the more vulnerable. Therefore, the greater likelihood is that the conflict in Syria is going to go on feeding that conflict in the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq?
Just wanted to say regarding the Kurdish issue, I agree with Dominic. I don't think they will separate. However, they will try to exert more influence and maybe to try and, by default, as it were, push towards implementing the Article 140, where there has to be a census of the people of Kirkuk, and they will try and bring a lot more Kurdish people into the area to influence that process. What would trigger a sectarian conflict? This is the true aim of al-Baghdadi and ISIS and the Baathists, whereas Ayatollah Sistani, in virtually every decree and statement that he has issued, he is warning against that, preventing that in any way possible, trying to avert that, even to the level of saying, you know, every community should respect each other, you should never use inflammatory language, the army, the volunteers should be part of the army, should not show strength in areas which are mixed, or all this in order to avert that. In terms of ISIS and al-Qaeda tactics, it may be that ISIS have been trying to put on a more sort of humanitarian face, but they cannot succeed because they are pathologically wired to destroy, kill, and terrorize, and so they won't succeed in that. The reports we've been getting is that Sunni imams have been executed in Mosul for not following the ISIS, towing the ISIS line. At least 5 girls, ladies, have been raped and have committed suicide. All the horror stories that one sees or hears is as a result of their policies, which they will not change.
To quickly add on, it is coming out from a lot of media outlets now, this Hearts and Minds campaign the ISIS have engaged on. I just want to add to what Zuhair said. Even if they have moderated themselves from before, it doesn't make they don't come anywhere close enough to being moderate. It just means they're slightly less extreme than they were, and they're learning a few lessons. Almost immediately after they took Mosul, they issued a statement saying anybody who calls them ISIS, in Arabic it's Daesh, al-Dawla al-Islamiyya fi al-Iraq wa Sham. Anybody who says the word Daesh gets 80 whips. For not calling them the Islamic State, for calling them ISIS. So the extremism that Zuhair was talking about, I don't think is going to last in terms of the Hearts and Minds campaign. And also there are reports now coming out of Mosul that they are checking to see, and this is house to house, which female members of a particular household aren't married. And in Iraq, your ID says if you're single or you're married. And obviously it's for the purpose of getting married to the jihadists. Many of whom we sometimes forget we're talking about Iraq, but many of these people are coming from North Africa and other Arab countries. There are hundreds, possibly in the low thousands, of foreign fighters in Iraq. Just on the issue of the likely effect of separation, in a word, I believe it's bloodbath, because the Kurds may be an exception and it's de facto anyway, and they have more independence. But the rest of Iraq, it never was and never will be, I think, neatly divided in terms of sectarian affiliation or communities. You can't just draw a line unless you plan to ethnically cleanse without killing anybody. It's going to be very hard. What do you do with the disputed areas? In fact, what do you do with the capital, Baghdad, even if you do have 2 regions? So I think it would be a recipe for disaster, because the people who are going to be drawing the lines aren't the guys in rooms or negotiations. It's going to be the young, angry men with guns on the ground, establishing facts. And I can't see a division as a solution. In fact, I think it will accelerate and just add more fuel to the fire.
Can I just say just 2 quick points? Is that okay?
Please, yeah.
Okay, just in relation to the Hearts and Minds campaign, or what people are referring to as the Hearts and Minds campaign by ISIS, I don't really know if there is such a campaign. I know that many people are using that terminology in English. I haven't followed ISIS's propaganda very closely, but I don't think they're using that terminology. And if you look at the sorts of things that Hayder describes, it's all true. They've immediately, as soon as they arrived in Mosul, they put out very harsh penalties for very minor issues or for non-issues. In Tikrit, when they arrived, they immediately shut down all the courts, put all the judges and lawyers out of a job, because now they have an Islamic wali who's responsible for issuing legal decrees and legal judgments. And according to their version of very, very strict Islamic law. I'm not sure there is such a campaign. I know that some people have said also that they're trying to reestablish services by picking up garbage and so on and so forth. But Tikrit now has been without power for the past few days. There's no electricity in Iraq for like 3 or 4 days, and I think it's been that way in Mosul as well. So I'm not really sure that this supposed effort by ISIS to bring people along to their side and try to convince ordinary Maslawis and Tikritis that they're not so bad. I'm not sure that such a campaign actually exists. And then also the other issue that Hayder mentions about bloodbath and so on and so forth, I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. But I would go one step further. I would say that it's not just the case that Sunnis and Shia cannot be neatly divided, but that also applies to a certain extent to Arabs and Kurds. There isn't a neat division between those two groups either. Certainly there are many areas where there are no Arabs, where there are only Kurds. But the entire disputed territory is disputed for good reasons, because they're mixed. And if you look at, for example, the Peshmerga, where they extended to, in Kirkuk, they had to stop at a very sharp line, not far from the edge of the city, right at the edge of the city, because those areas are not populated by people that are sympathetic to their presence. And they tried to take over those areas, but they couldn't. And some people I know were injured during the fight. So it's not a very neat division. They wouldn't be able to just draw a line to the south of Kirkuk and just assume that people on the other side of the line will just leave them alone forever. It would be very messy and very violent as well.
Can I draw out the question that was implicit in the lady at the front about the US and Iran? I think one of the interesting features of the crisis at the beginning was that everybody got, I think, rather overexcited about the prospect. A rival newspaper, a historic American-Iranian rapprochement over Iraq, which I think was over the top, to put it mildly. But there is a curious, is there a short-term, at least, identity of interest between these two very, very old enemies that can help produce any kind of, at least a stabilization of the situation? Or is that an illusion, because perhaps their motives are so different?
I think there is a genuine commonality of interest between America and Iran, and that interest is the stability of Iraq. They both want Iraq to be stable. They both want to reduce and eliminate the influence of the extremists, ISIS and al-Khoei. I think to say that they will cooperate militarily is taking it too far, but I think there will be political discussions and cooperation on that front. Also, of course, America doesn't want Iran to have too much influence in Iraq, but at the same time, America also wants Iran to have some kind of an input in areas where America cannot influence the influence of ISIS in Iraq.
I agree with that, and I'd looked at it in a slightly different way, which is sort of what I touched on in the opening remarks. For as long as America and Iran remain implacable enemies, and they've only been implacable enemies for 35 years, but as long as they remain implacable enemies, you're going to have a problem, whether in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or the Gulf, or you choose it. So change the dynamic. They've been served, both of them have been served up since 2004, but in reality, in the last year, a very appetizing meal that they could both share, which is coming to an agreement on the nuclear proliferation, on nuclear weapons. Now, if they manage to crack that one, you will change the dynamic. If you change the dynamic, then you start being able to deal with those currently intractable questions because they are implacable foes, on which actually they share a whole host of interests in resolving the dispute. So, the Nazi analogy may sound nice. I don't think it works.
Iran is not a real democracy. It's a theocratic government, really. What's that got in common with a democracy?
Well, there are a few other governments in the region who might fall into the same category. It doesn't stop us having a coincidence of interest, or indeed, quite developed relations with them.
If I could just add, this isn't something unprecedented. After 9/11 in Afghanistan, the Iranians and Americans clearly did work together through the Northern Alliance because they shared a common enemy in the Taliban. And in Iraq, the Americans and the Iranians, they support the same process, they support the same government, they even support the same purpose. So they do have a common enemy in ISIS. And I think they will cooperate, whether the Americans know it or not. Any military assistance the Americans are going to provide, especially if it comes in the form of advisors who are going to sort of help the Iraqi forces combat ISIS, they are going to be working with the Iranians because the Iranians now have mobilized their proxies in Iraq, and these are ideologically driven militias who are sometimes not just assisting but spearheading Iraqi army counter-terrorism operation. So it's going to be a reality on the ground, whether or not they like each other or are enemies.
But you're not going to see General Qasem Soleimani,
Not at this stage. No, not at this stage.
Sitting down with his American counterpart, are you?
No, but think back to 1999, and Shamkhani, who is now a national security advisor in Tehran, was given the Abdulaziz Medal by the Saudis. Things aren't entrenched, and it would be a mistake to think of them as so.
But can I also add that the dynamics, I do believe, is actually changing, and it's changing it's changing because of the change in mentality of the Iranian government, the new Iranian government with Rouhani at the helm. I have noticed a real change and a willingness to break barriers that were there and to move forward. And the issue of the nuclear issue is very clear. The Iranians are determined to make this work, determined to make it a success, because they know that they will build relations with America and the West on the back of that.
More executions in Iran than ever before.
Let's. We've got 5 minutes, so we can have 3 very quick-fire questions and equally quick-fire answers. So, please, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on, because we've been talking about Iran. Basically, short question: what type of involvement, or will we see any involvement, direct involvement of Iran in Iraq through advisors or maybe even military forces, especially maybe in the south, if ISIS was to advance in any way?
Okay,
there is already.
Yeah, that was.
Nivek Bernie, Eurasia Group. The panel's response to Tony Blair's op-ed in the FT yesterday, arguing that it's inherent sectarianism in Iraq, not 2003, that's caused this.
Okay, that's very pithy. And the last one, the guy at the back.
Hiya, just want to ask the panel if anybody knows what they think the impression of the younger generation is in Iraq. So I'm talking about 15, 16, 17. Do they have a very sectarian mentality? I mean, does the future look even more bleak, by the time they come in, or are they not affected by the sectarianism? I can't imagine that's the case. And Zaid, I presume your auntie might know as well, right? She was a teacher, probably sees a lot of students.
Not anymore, perhaps. Okay, so one last question to add to the list. Okay, lady at the back, and then we'll bring the...
I just wanted to ask your quick overview on relations between ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and any resource sharing, and how will that evolve?
Okay, thanks very much. So, please, whoever wants to whiz through those, any of them?
Do you mind if I start? Because I think my son's movie is about to end, so I think. So I'll try to make this very quick. So just in relation to Tony Blair's op-ed, so significant research was done in Iraqi over the course of Iraqi history, going back around about 5 centuries, if not more, looking into the incidents of sectarian violence that have taken place in the country. And the research was done by a combination of European and Iraqi scholars. And the conclusion was that prior to 2003, there were 3 incidents of civil wars on a sectarian basis in Iraqi history, and all 3 followed a foreign invasion on all 3 occasions. So either by Wahhabis, Persians, Ottomans, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And so 2003 wouldn't be an exception in that regard. You could argue, as Tony Blair does, that it would have happened anyway were it not for the foreign invasion, but I would argue in response that it surely can't be a coincidence that the 4 only incidents of large-scale civil violence on a sectarian basis in Iraq took place after foreign invasions. And in relation to younger generation of Iraqis, so my aunt sees a lot of them. Yes, it's true, but I see a lot of them too. I'm sure Hayder does too, so I'm sure he'd have a lot to say about this. What I could say is that they're very dynamic, very smart, very charming. Very interested in all things new to them. But what I would also say is that very many of them want to emigrate. It's a little bit depressing when you hear them say things like, "I never want to get married. I never want to have children. I'm not much of a traditionalist family person, but the reason why they say those things is because they don't want to bring children into this awful world that they find themselves in, and where they're just looking into constantly which countries they can emigrate to. I can't tell you the number of times people have asked me whether or not they can get asylum in Lebanon or in Turkey and so on and so forth. It happens just about every day. And it's not just people from Tikrit, it's people from all over. I have a good friend from Najaf who was threatened by his employer recently in an Iraqi ministry. I won't tell you which one. His only solution is now to emigrate. He sees no way out for himself or for his family. So it's very depressing, but it's a fact.
Thanks.
I'll leave it at that.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, on Soleimani, on IRGC, they're there, and doubtless they will go on increasing, and there will be an interesting piece of deconfliction that will be going on between the 300 American Special Forces, or whatever, advisors, and the IRGC forces. In the only other one, which was Tony Blair, oh God, how could I forget? 2003 created, it created the conditions in which, 2 conditions. One is we pitted, as a result of some of the decisions, we pitted the groups, the communities against each other. Not wittingly, but that was what the effect was. Secondly, I forgot what the second one is. Like Jim Baker's comment. So I'll pass it on to Hayder.
Yeah, I'm going to defend Tony Blair, so just an advanced warning. Obviously, Tony Blair has a very complicated relationship with the British press, but I think he makes a good point. Well, two good points. One, we can talk about the consequences of action, but let's not forget the consequences of inaction, and what would have happened had Saddam still been there, and what would have happened had an Iraqi Spring erupted during the Ba'ath reign. And sometimes I feel certain sections of the British press, their understanding of Iraqi history starts in 2003. This fantasy that it was all lovely and they used to get along very well and they used to have no problems between each other, no sectarian tensions, and suddenly we lifted the lid and Bush Blair came and it all erupted. Actually, that's not the case. If anything, in 2003 they overturned an earlier decision in the 1920s to install a minority in power in the first place. The reason I'm speaking to you in English and not Arabic is because in '91 my family were forced to flee Najaf, and there were tanks rolled into my hometown with flags saying no more Shia after today. So it's ludicrous to pretend there were no problems before 2003. 7th century, 10th century, 16th century, take your pick. Now I'm not saying Shias and Sunnis have always been killing each other. Of course, for hundreds of years they were living peacefully, but there are some pretty brutal episodes of sectarian violence, and I advise you to read Ali al-Wardi, and some of the violence and brutality makes what we're seeing today seem something you can stomach. Oh, sorry, quickly on the Iranian role in Iraq. The IRGC are there. I don't believe some of the reports. There are 300 or 400 fighters actually on the ground. But when I was there, I had met people who had met the IRGC General, Qasem Soleimani. So clearly he's there, it means others are there, but they're more in an advisory role. What's interesting is some of the reports coming out now being denied and not denied and counter-denied of Iraqi Air Force planes that were in Iran for safekeeping after the first Gulf War, now being returned to Iraq, being refurbished and returned to Iraq. I don't know what that means. Does that mean they're just giving them for free to the Iraqis? Is this a cover for Iranian IRG, Iranian Air Force activity under the guise or the flag of Iraqi Air Force planes? Something is happening, and I'm not sure what it is.
Okay, well, I think that we've reached the end. I'd like to thank our speakers very much indeed, and please show your appreciation in the usual way.